My name is Scarlett. I am 24 years old and I live in New York. On the outside, you'd probably think I have it all together. I live in a small but cozy apartment in Brooklyn, work as a marketing associate for a mid-sized fashion company, and have a circle of friends who I can always count on for brunch plans and Friday night drinks. My Instagram is filled with pictures of sunsets on rooftops, latte art, and spontaneous weekend getaways. But behind the filters, behind the carefully selected captions, lies a truth no one sees, a truth I've buried so deep I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. This is the secret I keep, a secret that has shaped every part of my life without anyone knowing. It started when I was 15. Back then, I lived in a quiet suburb just outside the city. My family wasn't perfect, but we were close enough. My dad worked long hours as an accountant. My mom stayed home and took care of the house, and I had a little brother named Eli who was 10 at the time. I was the quiet, observant type, a straight-A student who mostly stayed out of trouble. I had a few good friends, loved reading novels that made me cry, and dreamt of one day living in New York, chasing my dreams. I didn't know then how life can shatter those dreams in a matter of seconds. The day everything changed was just like any other. Ordinary, boring even. My parents were hosting a small dinner party, something they did occasionally for my dad's colleagues or church friends. That night, one of the guests brought along someone I hadn't met before. He was introduced as David, a distant cousin of my father's coworker. He was older, maybe in his late 20s, confident, charming, the kind of man adults naturally trusted. He smiled at everyone and made casual jokes that got polite laughs. I remember how my mom told me afterward that he was so respectful and well-spoken. But the way he looked at me that night made my skin crawl. It started small, compliments. That felt too personal. A hand on my shoulder that lingered a little too long. I told myself I was imagining it. I had always been sensitive to people's body language and tone, but maybe I was reading too much into it. That's what I thought, what I hoped. But the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. Then came the moment that would change everything. After dinner, while everyone was chatting in the living room, I went to the kitchen to get more napkins. David followed me. I didn't hear him at first, just felt him behind me, too close. He said something about how mature I looked for my age, how pretty I was. Then, without warning, he touched me. Just for a second. Just enough. I froze. My mind went blank. I felt my whole body go cold. I pushed past him and went upstairs, locked myself in the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't tell anyone. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. Who would believe me? A 15-year-old girl accusing a grown man that no one in the family even really knew? He hadn't done anything serious, I told myself. Just a touch. Just words. It wasn't like in the movies. Or the crime shows. And besides, maybe I had misread the situation. Maybe I was overreacting. So I stayed quiet. I kept the secret. But that moment didn't go away. It stayed with me. It grew, morphed into something bigger. Over time, it became a heavy weight I carried everywhere I went. By the time I turned 16, I had changed. I didn't trust people the way I used to. I flinched when someone got too close. I stopped dressing in anything too tight or too revealing, worried that I might attract the wrong kind of attention. My friends noticed the shift but didn't understand it. They thought I was just going through a moody teenage phase. My parents didn't notice at all. They were busy with work, with Eli, with their own lives, And I got really good at pretending. Pretending became my specialty. I pretended to be fine when I was breaking inside. I smiled in pictures, laughed at jokes, did well in school, and played the part of the good daughter and the responsible friend. But inside, I was constantly anxious. I couldn't explain why. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, soaked in sweat from nightmares I couldn't even remember. I started having panic attacks. My hands would go numb, my chest would tighten, and it would feel like I couldn't breathe. I learned to hide those too. Locking myself in the school bathroom until it passed. I started journaling. It was the only place I could be honest. Page after page, I wrote about that night, about David, about the fear, the shame, the guilt. I blamed myself more often than not. If I had spoken up, would it have made a difference? If I had screamed or told my parents, would I have been believed? Would they have protected me? But I never gave them that chance. I just kept it all inside. By the time I left for college, I thought I had buried it deep enough that it wouldn't follow me. I was wrong. College was a mixed bag. I loved the independence, the energy of the city, the chance to start fresh. But I also found that relationships, real, emotional relationships, were hard for me. I couldn't trust people, especially men. I would pull away when things got too close. I avoided parties, didn't drink, and made excuses to leave early. I had friends, but no one really knew me. I kept people at arm's length, afraid they'd see the cracks underneath. One night during my sophomore year, I was walking back to my dorm alone when a group of drunk guys catcalled me from across the street. It wasn't the first time, but something about it, maybe the tone, the look in their eyes, brought everything rushing back. I ran the last few blocks, locked myself in my room, and cried for hours. That's when I realized I hadn't healed. I had just hidden. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of finding their way to the surface. Even now, at 24, with a stable job and a new apartment, the past lingers like a shadow. I find myself avoiding certain conversations, certain places. I never talk about that night. I've tried therapy, but every time I sit across from a stranger and they ask me to tell them about myself, I freeze. Where do I even begin? And then I met someone. But before I tell you about him, you need to understand that the journey I've been on, the weight I've carried, was never about that one night alone. It was about everything that followed, about how silence can rot your insides, how pretending can become second nature, and how even when you think you've moved on, the past can still live inside you like a ghost. Meeting him was not a miracle or a magical fix. He didn't sweep in and erase my trauma. But he saw me, really saw me, and that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. His presence slowly began to unravel something inside me, something I thought was dead. The ability to trust, to open up, to speak. Meeting him wasn't something I expected. It happened in the most ordinary way, at a coffee shop near my office in Manhattan. It was a rainy Wednesday, the kind of cold, gray day that makes the city feel more like a concrete cage than a place of dreams. I had ducked into Brew Theory to grab my usual oat milk latte before heading into work, already dreading the pile of emails and meetings waiting for me. He was in line in front of me, fumbling with his wallet, clearly frustrated as he realized he'd left his card at home. Without thinking, I offered to cover his coffee. It was a small act of kindness, one I didn't expect to think about again. But he did something most people don't. He came back the next day to thank me. His name was Daniel. Daniel was different from the people I usually met in the city. He was calm, thoughtful, and attentive. He listened, really listened, like every word mattered. We started running into each other more often, at the coffee shop, on the subway, and eventually through planned hangouts. It began with casual conversations about music, our favorite movies, and the city's best pizza spots. But over time, those talks deepened. He asked questions no one had ever asked me before, not just the "what do you do?" kind, but the ones that touched something raw. What makes you feel safe? What are you afraid of? When was the last time you truly felt seen? I didn't answer all of them, not at first. I gave vague replies, dodged the ones that hit too close to home. But something about Daniel's presence made it harder to keep the mask on. He never pushed, but he always held space for me. I found myself looking forward to his texts, his silly jokes, his soft voice. For the first time in years, I began to feel something like hope. But with hope came fear. I had spent so long keeping people out that letting someone in felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. Every time Daniel got too close, my instincts kicked in. I'd pull away, cancel plans, avoid eye contact. I told myself it was better this way, safer. But Daniel never gave up, not in a clingy or forceful way, just steady, present, patient. One night, after a long walk through Central Park, he asked me if I had ever been in love. I hesitated, then said no. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. I had never allowed myself to fall in love, because love required vulnerability, and I had buried mine years ago. That night, when I got home, I cried harder than I had in a long time. Something inside me was shifting. The walls I had built to protect myself were starting to crack. I started having dreams again, vivid ones. Sometimes they were just flashes of memory. David's hand on my shoulder, the way he looked at me, the moment I locked myself in the bathroom. Other nights, the dreams twisted into nightmares. I'd wake up gasping, shaking, alone in my bed. The secret was no longer content to stay buried. It wanted out. I started journaling again. Page after page, I poured everything out. My anger, my guilt, my fear, my confusion. The words came out messy and ugly, but they were honest. I wrote about how I hated myself for staying silent, how I wished someone had noticed the change in me back then, how I felt like a fraud every time I smiled in public or posted a happy photo online. I wrote about how I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but didn't know how. Daniel started noticing the cracks in my armor. He didn't say it outright, but he could tell something was off. One night, after dinner at his place, we were sitting on his couch when he gently placed his hand over mine and asked, "Scarlett, what are you not telling me?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. I stared at our hands, the warmth of his skin against mine, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I pulled my hand away, grabbed my coat, and left without saying a word. I didn't answer his texts that night, or the next day, or the day after that. I started spiraling. The anxiety that had been quietly humming beneath the surface exploded into full-blown panic. I couldn't sleep. I stopped eating. I skipped work for 2 days and lied to my boss about being sick. I was terrified, not just of telling Daniel the truth, but of what it would mean to finally say it out loud, to admit that something terrible had happened to me, that it wasn't my fault, that I had been a child, that I deserved better. One night, as I sat on the floor of my apartment, knees hugged to my chest, I opened my journal and read through the last few entries. My handwriting was shaky, the ink smeared with old tears. I found the page I had written months ago, the one where I described everything about that night. David's touch, his voice, my silence. I took a deep breath, picked up my phone, and texted Daniel. "Can we talk?" He replied almost instantly. We met at the same coffee shop where we first met. It was late, nearly closing time, and the place was mostly empty. Daniel looked worried but didn't press. He waited, like he always did. I sat down across from him, heart pounding in my chest, palms sweating. I had rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times in my head, but when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. Tears welled up in my eyes. My lips trembled. I looked down at the table and whispered, "When I was 15, something happened." Daniel reached across the table, gently took my hand, and said, "Take your time." So I did. Piece by piece, I told him everything. I told him about the dinner party, about David, about the years I spent pretending it didn't happen. I told him how it changed me, how it made me afraid, how I carried it like a stone in my chest every single day. I didn't look at him the entire time. I was too afraid of what I might see in his eyes: pity, disgust, confusion. But when I finally looked up, all I saw was love. Daniel didn't say much. He just held my hand. And when I started crying, he moved to sit next to me and wrapped his arms around me. For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt safe. Not because he had fixed me, not because he had erased my pain, but because he had seen me and didn't run. That night, after we left the cafe, I went home and opened my laptop. I typed out everything I had just told Daniel and saved it in a document titled "The Secret I Keep." I didn't know why I did it. Maybe because I wanted to remember that moment. Maybe because a part of me still didn't believe I had actually said the words out loud. But it was real. It had happened. And I wasn't the same girl who kept it buried anymore. Telling Daniel wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something new. In the days that followed, I started doing something I had been afraid to do for years. I reached out to a therapist. I made an appointment. I showed up. I sat in that office, legs shaking, voice trembling, and told my story again, this time to someone trained to help me make sense of it, to heal. The process wasn't easy. Therapy forced me to revisit memories I had tried to forget, to confront the beliefs I had formed about myself, that I was weak, that I was broken, that I didn't deserve love. But with each session, the weight grew a little lighter. I learned that trauma doesn't define who I am, that healing isn't linear, that some days would still be hard, but I wasn't alone anymore. One of the most powerful moments in therapy came when my counselor asked, "What would you say to 15-year-old Scarlett if she were sitting in front of you right now?" I broke down. Because for the first time, I realized how much I had blamed that girl, how much shame I had placed on her shoulders. But she was just a kid, a scared, confused, innocent girl who didn't know how to speak up, and she didn't deserve to carry that weight for the rest of her life. I would tell her it's not her fault, I said, that she's not broken, that she's brave for surviving. The secret I had kept for so long was no longer eating me alive. It had lost its power. And in its place, something new was growing. Truth, strength, freedom. Daniel stood by me through it all. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't pressure me. He just stayed. And that made all the difference. I don't know what the future holds. I still have bad days. There are still moments when the memories creep in, when the anxiety returns, when I want to shut down. But now I have tools. I have support. I have a voice. And for the first time in my life, I'm learning to use it. But there was one more step I needed to take. One more chapter of this story that needed to be written. Because while telling Daniel and myself the truth was freeing, there was still someone I hadn't confronted. Someone who had been there from the beginning but never knew what happened under their roof. And now it was time. It was time to tell my family. As I stood at the edge of everything I had buried for years, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about facing the truth with open eyes and an open heart. The secret I kept no longer owned me. It shaped me, yes, but it did not define me. Speaking out, first to Daniel and then to myself, was the first real breath I had taken in years. And now, as I prepared to tell my family, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of reclaiming my life, my voice, and the power that had been stolen from me. I was no longer just surviving. I was finally learning how to live,